the one big beautiful bill, as it's been dubbed by the Trump administration and the Republican leadership in both houses of Congress, is moving down the pike, as it were. And one, of course, major element of that is a massive set of tax cuts that certainly seem to favor one set of people over others, although I know the White House is trying to contest that. So to get to the bottom of what's really happening here, Rania, we are very, very honored to be joined by Amy Hanauer, who is the executive director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you, and thanks also to the whole ITEP team for putting out fantastic analysis on this. And I, having read it, have a little bit of a sense of what's happening. But for our viewers who maybe haven't, the White House is saying that this is a bill that will have tax cuts that mainly benefit working and middle class Americans. And so I'd just like to ask you, are they telling the truth?
That is an absolute lie. This bill actually delivers over the next decade $1 trillion to the top 1% of taxpayers in America. $1 trillion, and those are brand new numbers based on this bill. 70% of the benefits go to the top 20%, the wealthiest 20% of earners. This is not equitable. It takes money from programs that help low and middle income people and shifts it to the wealthy.
It's so insane. It's so insane that that's a massive transfer of wealth. And on top of that, this bill slashes food aid, healthcare, all kinds of social supports at a time when millions across the US are already struggling. So I'm curious if you can talk about the specific programs that are going to take a hit here and what the real life consequences of those cuts might look like.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking about that. I mean, this really is a sort of shift in our history. It is a historic change in the way we want to approach our people. So these are the biggest cuts to food aid in history in the United States, and really kind of reneging on a long-term promise, like a commitment that the federal government made, that while food aid has always been very, 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 very modest, that we would make sure that the very hungriest children and people with disabilities and elderly people in our country would at least get a minimal amount of food. But this bill reneges on that promise. It's also the biggest cuts in history to healthcare coverage, and that will affect both lower income families who are on Medicaid, but it will also affect families who have been getting Affordable Care Act subsidies.
Amy, one of the things that ITEP also does fairly frequently that I think is notable is you put out a report on corporations that basically pay no taxes because they're able to sort of, do all these different pieces. So we know that the tax cuts for the wealthiest people and corporations are so big, but we know there's also big cuts to the IRS as well. So, I mean, is it possible that the tax cuts could even be bigger than we expect for the wealthy because it will be easier for them to exploit loopholes?
Well, there's always that possibility. There are always ways that these things play out a little bit differently than what we expect. I think at the scale that we're talking about, though, the story is just really, really clear. And what you're saying about the IRS is valid. Like, the IRS has been really, just stripped of its power to enforce the tax code on the wealthiest people and corporations. And what that means is that they then tend to turn their energy to low-income families who collect the earned income tax credit, leaving all of this money on the table from these wealthy tax cheats. So it's really a kind of crazy way of doing things.
Amy, I think every few years, especially when there's Republicans in charge, but it can even happen when there's Democrats in charge sometimes, you'll have these bills that end up giving more tax cuts to the wealthy, to the point where some people might hear that and think, oh yeah, this is just like another version of what we see when these people are in charge, is more tax cuts for the wealthy. So I'm just curious if you can talk a bit about how this bill is different from perhaps past bills where we've seen these massive tax cuts for the rich. Because yes, this sort of, is an evolution of that, but this kind of goes to more extreme degrees.
That's right. I mean, this is actually the biggest upward redistribution of wealth in our nation's history because it so aggressively cuts programs that serve low and middle income families, primarily low income families, really. And it so aggressively shifts resources to the wealthiest people and corporations. And so that's kind of historic. And I'll just say the three major things that this bill really, really weakens is it weakens the progressive income tax. That's a very progressive tax because the more you earn, the more you pay. It weakens the corporate income tax, and we can get into that a little bit more in follow-up questions if you want, but that is a very progressive tax that falls heavily on the wealthiest people and also happens to fall on foreign investors. So they'll both be getting a break in this. And it weakens the estate tax, which is the stopgap we have against intergenerational transfer of wealth from dynastic wealthy families to their heirs. Those families can now hand down $30 million before anyone pays a penny of estate tax. So this is just going to perpetuate a really extreme income divides, racial wealth divides in this country.
Wow, that's the state tax. That's quite something. I do want to talk more about the corporate income tax because obviously I think corporations have had, a pretty good run of years. And I think all of us who've been suffering from inflation have certainly been, feeling that. We've been paying a lot more, and you see the share buybacks, you see, billionaires gaining more and more money. So talk about that if you could, because I think, obviously big corporations are what a lot of people think about when they think about who should be paying larger shares of their profits towards our shared needs.
Yeah, I mean, so my organization, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and anyone who's listening can find our stuff at itep.org, itep.org. We monitor this. And so we found in 2022, I think it was, that 55 highly profitable corporations paid zero in corporate income taxes that year. And we found that after the first Trump tax law, the 2017 tax law, that there just was a really dramatic decline in the share of their income that corporations were paying in taxes. So well below the corporate rate. I mean, I believe the average share that corporations are paying was in the 12% range. That's on a rate that's 21%. So you just see this ability to really avoid responsibility. And the irony is that it's the infrastructure that we've put in place that, of course, has enabled these corporations to build their wealth in the first place. I mean, it's because we have good roads and good infrastructure to get products out to market. It's because we have a solid banking system that's regulated that people feel safe spending. And but despite that, we want to balance the budget on people who qualify for Medicaid, which is very, very low income families.
So I want to ask you about what the pushback has been. Are Democrats pushing back, or did they push back? Because now this bill has made it through Congress. Did they push back in any meaningful way, or was there some bipartisan complicity here?
I mean, in fairness to the Democrats, not one Democrat voted for this bill. And I think that there were some really lively exchanges where a number of members of the Senate and the House really tried to draw attention to just how devastating this piece of legislation is going to be to our economy and to low and middle income families. So I believe they introduced more amendments than has ever been introduced before. And they introduced amendments that really highlight the estate tax cuts, the corporate tax cuts, the income tax cuts, the Medicaid cuts. They tried to introduce amendments that would protect people on Medicaid. So I think that there was pretty good unity in that regard. Now, whether or not Democrats are doing a good job of communicating to voters, I think that's another story entirely. I think a lot of voters don't understand what just happened. This bill is extraordinarily unpopular when people learn the details, but a lot of people, it's just flying under the radar.
No, I think that's very true. And there's been so much obfuscation. I mean, that White House press conference with, workers coming up there, making it seem like that. So a lot of confusion. And it makes me wonder about another issue too regarding this is, I think the vast majority of people, we're all worried about, the cost of everything seems to be going up, more or less month to month, but everything's getting more expensive. And the tariffs, we don't know exactly how that's going to land, but that feels like that could have a big impact because even if I do get, a bigger tax refund, it feels like a lot of it could just be, wiped away.
No, 100%. And we did analysis of this for the first time and just found that for 80% of the population of the United States, the increase in cost from tariffs is going to either make it so that the tax cuts make you break even, or it's even going to result in a loss. So that's before you even get to the Medicaid cuts and the healthcare cuts. The tariffs alone sort of wipe out most of the tax savings for low and middle income families. I think we're going to see really big price spikes for American families for a lot of things that we've counted on getting. And, there's a role for tariffs when they're accompanied by a sort of smart industrial strategy, but this ain't it.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking to that, I want to ask you about the long-term consequences here, because I think with these kinds of things, and I know this is like really unprecedented, like you described it as the biggest wealth transfer in history, it's easy to kind of see it in the moment, be like, oh no, this is horrible, and move on. But what are the long-term impacts we're going to see from this on inequality, on that sort of racial and intergenerational inequality, and I guess moving forward, what does that mean for the country?
Yeah. It's funny that you asked that. I recently had a loss in my family, and it got me thinking about how somebody born in 1934, what kind of arc of life they were able to have. And of course, the biggest problem in the United States has always been that we didn't deliver those opportunities in an equitable way. But for many people living in the 20th century, that's when we established the estate tax. It's when we established the income tax. It's when we established the corporate tax. And it's when we established Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food aid to families. A lot of these were outgrowths of the Great Depression. Well, are we providing those same kinds of opportunities for a kid born today? I really hate to say it, but I just don't think that we are. And so instead of moving in the direction of saying, hey, we provided this opportunity for some, let's make sure we provide it for everyone, I think what Republicans did this week was the exact opposite, which is to say, hey, we're providing this to some, let's just restrict who gets that kind of opportunity even further. So it's a daunting moment for somebody who cares about this country.
No, I think that's for sure. It doesn't feel like a beautiful bill, at least to me, in this context. Amy, you mentioned it at a little bit earlier, but I just want you to mention it again, where folks can find your work, because you all are doing fantastic stuff, and not just at the federal level, also examining at the state level everything that's happening with taxes.
Yeah, you can find any of the things that I've talked about today at itep.org. That's where you can find that we're giving $1 trillion to the top 1%. That the tariffs exceed the savings for a lot of taxpayers, and that this is just a heavily skewed piece of legislation.
Amy Hanauer, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side today.
Wonderful to be here.